Hello, in today's video we're going to be looking at globalisation, an introduction. So we're going to look at the basics of what globalisation is, why it's important, how it impacts on us on a day-to-day basis. So globalisation can mean lots of different things to different people. It's very, very difficult to define, but there are some basic things which can probably be applied to how we think about globalisation. But the thing to bear in mind is it has an impact on absolutely every aspect of our lives. The food we eat, where our clothes come from, if we've got computers or telephones, mobiles, all of these things, they're made up of components that come from all sorts of different countries. Even just have a look in your fridge and see where all the different produce comes from. It gives you an idea of how much globalisation can impact on our lives, and it happens without us even realising it. But there are some issues that we'll consider as well, some ethical issues and some arguments against globalisation, which we'll be looking at generally as well. So going back to the basic principles, what is globalisation? There's various different books that you can read, different approaches that will tell you it's something modern and new and contemporary. But there are other theorists that say, it goes back to post-industrial revolution, when the European countries were expanding, they were taking over and setting up bases in other countries as well. So globalisation comes from empire building. But at its most basic, globalisation is about trade. It's about opening up trading horizons, removing the barriers so that different countries can trade with each other, that companies can expand, they can go into new markets. And the idea of barrier-free trade, which is really one of the fundamental ideas behind globalisation, this barrier-free trade means that the countries are trading with each other without any barriers, without any import restrictions, taxes. We see that those barriers being imposed if we think about countries wanting to introduce sanctions on each other or looking to protect their own domestic markets. They'll increase the cost of importing, or they'll try to block trading with particular countries as well. So the idea of globalisation is that we want to try and remove all of that. We want to open up the markets so that the markets can trade freely and try to improve competitiveness, try to improve quality, efficiency. So we start off with a trade in products, goods and services. But if you think about migration patterns and economic migration, where people are travelling from one country looking for a better life, looking for better job opportunities, they will go and work in another country, they will immigrate. So our globalisation is not just about economic drivers in terms of trade, it's also economic drivers in terms of economic migration, where people are moving to other countries looking for better quality of life, better employment opportunities, for example. So globalisation is underpinned primarily by economic drivers, but there are two other what I've called facilitators here. There are two other aspects of globalisation that are contributing to the rapid increase that we're seeing in contemporary society. Certainly prior to COVID, that would be the case. Obviously, this is something that's very new to everybody, so we still have to wait and see what's going to happen in terms of COVID going forward. But the two key things that have allowed this global trade to increase and grow so much is because transportation has made it much more easy to get about. It's easy to ship containers across the world, and as I said at the very beginning, you're buying food that comes from a range of different countries, and just how easy it is to get that moved about, pop it on a plane, stick it on a boat, and just wait for it to get delivered. So that makes it much, much easier. And combined with that, the technology has improved and allowed us to communicate much more easily. So we don't have to go to the high street to buy our goods. If we're looking for something, what do? We maybe look on Amazon, we look on the computer, we look on the internet, we are communicating with people across the world, we're communicating different time zones, different geographic areas, different languages sometimes even, and there are apps and tools that will translate languages, so we don't even need translators in a lot of cases. But the technology allows us to order goods and services, and perhaps as well it's allowing us to communicate using Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all these sorts of tools as well, that even with COVID restricting travel, restricting how we move about, potentially it's not going to have a negative impact on how we communicate. So we will still have that global contact, and the effect of globalisation may change going forward, but it's not going to disappear. So a little bit more detail on the economic theory. So we have free trade and open market economies, as I've said already. We're looking at barrier-free trade. So free trade, different countries are able to work with each other, and open market economies, the theories behind that is that a government that operates within an open market economy, or countries that have an open market economy, typically believe that you don't want heavy regulation. You want to allow the markets to control what happens, to control the market. So the market itself is setting prices. It's managed through the supply and demand of goods. So if lots of people are producing something in another country that's being bought up, then that's going to increase the trade. Okay, so open market economy is important because it's a philosophy about how the countries operate, where they think it's important to put their emphasis, and where it's important for the government to be involved and to intervene. And as I said, a true open market economy will believe that the government, the politicians should take a back seat, should not be involved, and should let the organisations, let the commerce drive itself. They'll decide what they're willing to pay, what they're willing to sell their goods for. So the supply and demand will determine all of that, whether it's in a local market or whether it's in an international market. There is an argument as well that by having globalisation, by opening up this market and this trade, that as we're looking to buy goods and services from perhaps developing countries, that we're putting more money into these economies. Local people are getting paid for their work, for their employment, and it should drive up their wages. We'll look and see that it is argued that's not always the case, but the argument is that this is what should happen. So it should be helping developing countries to develop more quickly, to lift themselves out of poverty, and to improve the lives and the working conditions for people in these countries. But it can be abused, and that's why we also have international global regulation. Individual countries can't regulate something that's carried out internationally. Think about all the debates there are about how do you control what's happening on the web? How do you police that? How do you police inappropriate actions and inappropriate behaviour that is carried out on the web, whether it's crime being organised through the dark web, whether it's pornography sites? How do you make sure that this is all regulated? You can't do it by individual countries trying to control what happens in their own country, because the site organisers will go off site. They'll go to another country where the regulation is perhaps more relaxed. So we have things like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. All of these organizations are set up to establish standards for international trade, to make sure that it's fair, The World Trade Organization, for example, sets minimum standards for trading internationally. So with Britain leaving the European Union at the end of 2020, if they have not agreed trade agreements with the countries they want to trade with, then the set of standards that have been established by the World Trade Organization have to be followed. So they have to do what the World Trade Organization sets as a standard if they don't have something of their own. So although open market economy theory would suggest that no intervention, leave the markets to control themselves, the reality is that we need some regulation just to make sure that things aren't being exploited, that developing countries, for example, are not being taken advantage of, and that they are getting the opportunity to trade. Okay, so hopefully that's all clear. Arguments against globalisation. I'm not really going to go into too much in terms of the anti-globalisation, anti-capitalism movement, but they are a strong voice who are advocates of why globalisation is a bad thing. And it's things like ethical questions that people are being exploited, people are not being lifted out of poverty in the way you should. We hear stories of child labour, people being sold to factory owners in developing countries where parents just need the money so much because they're living in such dire poverty that they believe by selling their children to factory owners, they're actually giving their children a better standard of life. So there's a lot of backlash about how these people are treated, and encouraging us to be aware and be responsible consumers of goods and services, that we're not buying from countries or companies that are exploiting the labour force in those countries. That's linked in with the not everyone benefits. It's the same idea. Another argument is that associated with globalisation is a feeling that globalisation is driven by America, and all the different countries adopt American habits, languages, clothes, culture. So the national culture can get lost, can be diluted, so it's not got, the countries don't have their own strong individual identities because it's being subsumed by an American culture. In reality, not every global company is American. Yes, there are a lot of global American-owned companies, but there are also global companies that are British, global companies that are European, global companies that are Japanese, Chinese. So there's influences coming from lots of different areas, but as I said, one of the arguments is that because of globalisation, because we're all buying from the same companies, iPhone and Samsung dominate the mobile phone market, so you don't have a lot of choice, you don't have a lot of range, so everybody's likely to have very similar phones, for example. The environmental impact, the pollution, the air miles that are being travelled by goods and services being brought to your domestic markets, carbon footprint, all of these sorts of things would come under the environmental impact. That we do see campaigns for buying local produce, supporting local business. And that's really what that's fighting against, as well as this idea of the environmental impact of international trade, global trade. I will be making additional videos to follow up on some of the points that have been covered here. So please feel free to sign up to my YouTube channel, subscribe so that you'll get notification when additional videos are posted, and please, if you've enjoyed the video, if you found it useful, please indicate that by liking it. Thank you very much for listening.